He stood in the center of the square, lighter in one hand, the Koran in the other. His heart beat like a war drum, not with fear, but with the bitter fire of hatred he didn't fully understand. A crowd gathered, some angry, some curious, some silently grieving. He lit the flame and held it to the sacred pages. Smoke curled into the sky like a cry for help. Cameras flashed. Voices rose. And as the book turned to ash, he smiled, believing he had made a point, believing he had won something. But what happened next, within hours, was a lesson that would burn far deeper than the paper he destroyed. It didn't just leave the crowd speechless. It silenced him. He was a man shaped by headlines and fear. Every image of war, every report of violence, every slur and stereotype had carved a story into his mind. He had never read the Quran, never spoken to a Muslim, never entered a mosque. But his conviction felt righteous. He told himself it was about freedom, about standing against oppression. Yet deep down, it was about pain. His father had died in a war overseas. His mother cried at night, holding the flag that was handed to her at the funeral. Nobody ever explained who the real enemy was. So he created one, and the book for him became the symbol of everything that had hurt him. But the fire he started did not end with the charred pages. Hours after the act, the video had gone viral. Millions watched, some with rage, some with heartbreak, others with prayer. Yet among the flood of comments, there was one that stood out. A message from a man in the Middle Easting. "Brother, I forgive you. Not because what you did was right, but because my faith teaches me to respond with mercy. I invite you to read what you burned." He stared at the comment for hours. At first he laughed. Forgiveness, mercy. It felt like weakness. But he couldn't shake the feeling. Who was this man? Why would someone he had insulted so deeply respond with kindness? It gnawed at him. He didn't sleep that night. The image of the burning book haunted him, not because of guilt, but because of confusion. For the first time, he questioned whether he truly understood what he had destroyed. The next morning, he walked into a bookstore, hoodie pulled low, eyes avoiding contact. He went to the religion section and stood in front of a shelf labeled Islam. His fingers trembled as he picked up a copy of the Quran, the same book he had set on fire just the day before. He bought it without a word and walked quickly out the door. He didn't tell anyone, not his friends, not the online followers who had praised his courage. At home, he sat on his bed, opened the first page, and began to read. In the beginning, it felt like a foreign language, verses that seemed strange, stories he didn't understand, but as he kept reading, a shift began. He found words of peace, of justice, of patience. He read about Moses and Jesus. He read about mercy and forgiveness. And then he read a verse that shook him to the core. It said, "Repel evil with that which is better." And thereupon, the one whom between you and him is hatred will become as though he were a devoted friend. He dropped the book. Tears filled his eyes. How could a book he was taught to hate hold words like that? He began researching, watching videos, listening to Muslims speak about their faith, their lives, their struggles. He read about Malcolm X, about converts, about peace found in places he had never imagined. He reached out to the man who had forgiven him. The man invited him to visit his mosque. He hesitated. What if they recognize me? What if they hate me? But something pushed him. A voice deep inside whispered, "Go." He arrived at the mosque wearing the same hoodie, head down. He was greeted at the door, not with anger, but with warmth. Smiles, handshakes. Someone handed him a cup of tea. Another offered him a seat. He waited for the backlash, the confrontation. It never came. Instead, he sat in silence as the call to prayer echoed through the walls. Something stirred in him, a stillness he had never known. After the prayer, the Imam approached him. "You are welcome here," he said. "We know who you are. But we also know what the Quran teaches us." The man broke down. In front of strangers, in a place he once hated, he cried like a child. He apologized over and over, and they embraced him. They told him that the fire he set did not destroy their faith. It strengthened it. In the weeks that followed, his life changed. He continued reading. He started asking questions. And the more he learned, the more he let go of the anger he had carried for so long. One day, while sitting with the man who had first messaged him, he asked, "Why did you forgive me?" The man smiled. "Because the Quran says, 'Do not let the hatred of a people prevent you from being just.' Be just. That is nearer to righteousness. I couldn't let your hate turn me into something I'm not." He sat in silence. That verse echoed in his mind like thunder. He realized he had been a prisoner of his own pain, and the very people he thought were enemies had shown him a path to freedom. Months passed. He returned to the square where it all began. This time, he stood with a microphone in hand, not a lighter. A crowd gathered again. Some recognized him. Cameras turned on. But the message was different now. "I came here once to destroy something I didn't understand," he said. "I thought I was strong, but I was lost. I burned a book that represents mercy, justice, and truth. And what I found in return was not revenge, but love. What I did was wrong, but what I received was a gift, a second chance." People listened. Some wept. Others stood in disbelief. And when he finished speaking, he held up a copy of the Quran, not to burn it, but to honor it, to share it, to testify that the words inside it had changed his heart. His story spread again, but this time it inspired. A man once known for hate was now known for transformation. Schools invited him to speak. Communities asked him to tell his story. And everywhere he went, he shared the verse that had saved him from himself, repel evil with that which is better. He was no longer the man who needed enemies to make sense of his pain. He was no longer defined by rage or fear. The Quran he burned had not only survived the fire, it had lit a flame inside him that could not be extinguished. He learned that fire can destroy, but it can also purify. And sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the worst mistakes. What he thought would be the end of someone else's faith became the beginning of his own journey. The man who set the Quran on fire ended up finding light in its words. And the world, for a moment, was reminded that even the hardest hearts can soften. Even the greatest hate can be undone. And sometimes, the most powerful answer to darkness is not more darkness, but the brilliance of unexpected mercy. So when people ask what happened after he burned the Quran, the answer is simple. He burned it, but the Quran burned brighter. He tried to silence it, but it spoke louder. He tried to shame it, but it forgave him. And in doing so, it gave him back his humanity, That is why the world went silent. Because no one expected the book to win. Not with vengeance, but with love. And that is the power of truth. You can burn the pages, but you cannot burn the light. You can tear the paper, but you cannot erase the message. You can deny the words, but you cannot stop them from reaching the heart. Because truth, real truth, doesn't need to scream. It only needs to shine. And that is what the Quran did that day. It shined through smoke and flame, through hatred and ignorance, and reached a man who had never expected to be changed. And in that moment, the fire didn't destroy. It awakened. The Quran wasn't just a book he burned. It was a mirror he tried to shatter, only to find his own reflection staring back, waiting to be healed. And so, from the ashes of his hate rose something the world didn't expect, not silence, not revenge, but a voice that said, "I was wrong, and the truth set me free." He began attending the mosque more frequently, quietly at first, sitting in the back during lectures, listening, observing. He no longer came with the same weight on his shoulders. The anger that had fueled him for so long had started to melt away. In its place was curiosity, humility, and an ache for peace he never thought he deserved. Every time he stepped into the mosque, he was met with the same kindness. There was no judgment, no bitterness. The people who should have turned him away were the ones who embraced him. One evening, during a community gathering, an elderly man approached him. His beard was white, his eyes deep with age and wisdom. He took the young man's hand and said, "You are brave, not for what you did, but for admitting it and for coming back here. That takes a different kind of courage. May God continue to guide you." He felt tears form again. Every encounter, every verse he read, chipped away at the walls around his heart. He started keeping a journal. Each entry was a record of the transformation happening within him. He wrote about his first time hearing the Quran recited in Arabic, how it moved him even though he didn't understand the words. He described his first Ramadan fast, the pain of hunger followed by the sweetness of breaking bread with others. He wrote about the young boy who hugged him after prayer and said, "I'm glad you're my brother now." That word, brother, meant more to him than anyone realized. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged. But his past wasn't easily forgotten. He still received threats, hate mail, messages from old friends calling him a traitor. Some accused him of doing it all for attention. Others said he had been brainwashed. He didn't respond with arguments or anger. He responded with patience. When they cursed him, he prayed for them. When they insulted him, he forgave them, because he had finally understood what strength really looked like. One night, alone in his room, he opened the Quran again. He reached a verse that struck him like lightning. Indeed, Allah will not change the condition of a people until they change what is in themselves. That verse didn't just speak to nations, it spoke to individuals. It spoke to him. He had lived in darkness for so long, waiting for someone else to change the world. But change had to start within. And it had. He remembered the exact moment when the idea of taking his own life had crossed his mind. It was before the fire, before the fame. He had been lost, hopeless. And yet now he had found meaning in the very thing he once despised. That realization broke him open. He fell to his knees and wept. not because he was ashamed, but because he was grateful. Grateful that God hadn't given up on him, even when he had given up on himself. Time passed. He started volunteering at shelters, speaking at schools, helping others who were angry, confused, broken. He told them his story, not to boast, but to warn, to show them where hate leads and where love can begin. People listened, not because he was eloquent, but because he was real. His story was messy, raw, honest. And it was powerful because it wasn't about perfection. It was about redemption. One evening, during a charity dinner at the mosque, a young woman approached him. She was quiet, nervous, holding something wrapped in cloth. She handed it to him and said, "My father was in the crowd the day you burned the Quran. He cried that day. He cried again when he saw your video later. This was his Quran. He wants you to have it." He unwrapped the cloth with shaking hands. The book inside was old, the edges worn, the pages filled with notes in the margins. It smelled like history, like pain, like healing. He held it to his chest. "Please tell him thank you," he whispered. That Quran became his most treasured possession. He read it every day, not out of obligation, but out of love. Each page reminded him of the journey he had taken, from hate to hope, from ignorance to understanding, from fire to faith. Eventually, he took the step that surprised even himself. In front of the very community he had once hurt, he stood and uttered the words that changed his life forever. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa Allah, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadar Rasul Allah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. The room erupted in joy. Tears flowed. Hugs were exchanged. He felt something inside him release. A weight he had carried for years lifted. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't suddenly a scholar, but he was sincere. And that sincerity was what mattered most. The media didn't cover his conversion. The cameras didn't come back. The world moved on, chasing newer stories. But those who had seen his journey up close knew that something extraordinary had happened. A heart had changed. A soul had been saved, and the Quran he once tried to destroy had become the compass of his life. And as he walked out of the mosque that day, surrounded by people who once had every reason to hate him, but chose instead to love him, he looked up at the sky and smiled. Not because everything was easy now, but because for the first time in his life, everything was clear.